Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm reviewing the Easton Press leather-bound edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. Been doing a lot of these Easton Press ones lately. This one's interesting, and a lot of the Easton Press ones are going to feature a lot of beautiful pictures. In this case, the only picture you have is on the frontispiece, which is of course that famous tree where Scout and her brother find things, but otherwise you're not going to find any other illustrations in the text, and that's fine with me. Although I really do love the illustrations I get to see inside an Easton Press edition, it's not required for me to appreciate the layout and the typesetting, etc. So, To Kill a Mockingbird is very much one of those books that all American school children are required to read in high school. So I would put The Great Gatsby in this category, I would put Romeo and Juliet in this category, and I have to admit, I don't think I'm the only person. We tend to think of these books as overrated or not that important because everybody's forced to read them, so potentially it's overrated. And I have my own personal aversion to things that are popular. However, as you come back to these books as you get older, which I have, you come to realize, and I did this in particular the case of The Great Gatsby, just how fine these works are. And for some reason, and I don't know why I'm hesitating to give teachers the credit that they deserve, the teachers got it right by picking some of these because they were good enough to spur a discussion at the high school level, and they are more than adequate to spur a discussion in adulthood. And what's interesting is because obviously the book, as you get older, you can see there's the challenges of single parenthood, and there's the questions of class difference. But the most obvious one that we talked about in high school, that is probably still talked about today, is the race question, which this book, I think, provides a worthy contribution to. And if you go onto YouTube, you're going to find today reviews of this book saying that, in a way, it's somewhat racist or perpetuates racism because it gives the frame of a white person. So, Harper Lee is to be canceled or ignored because she wrote about it from her perspective. So either the logical conclusion is white people aren't allowed to write about their perspective, or there isn't a conversation going on. And I think this is something that would be ironically ignored by particularly black critics of To Kill a Mockingbird, because if you are familiar with the black literature, let's just go in a straight line chronologically. Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, and terminating, let's say recently terminating, it's still going, but with Ta-Nehisi Coates, you watch this accommodation moving towards frustration, moving towards anger. I'm sorry, and I didn't include Malcolm X in that list, but he would be that Malcolm X, James Baldwin, white-hot anger at the situation, which boiled over, you could say, and has cooled down in recent years. We can say Black Lives Matter, with its problematic roots and clear, stealing from people to, build millionaire houses, that it's somewhat simmered to where I would point to Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think his Between the World and Me came out in 2016, where you have a quiet resignation to the state of affairs. And I think that resignation is warranted because so many Americans want to personalize and subjectivize any discussion about race as about themselves. So if you say something like, there's a race problem in America, the answer will either be, well, I'm not racist, or I have black friends. And I've said this, I think I've talked about this in other videos, that if you don't acknowledge that if you can't acknowledge that there is a race problem, you can't even begin to deal with it. You can't solve a problem that no one acknowledges. And so you have to, I think, sometimes lead people with questions and say, yes, I understand that your brother is a police officer, you know a bunch of police officers, but are you willing to admit that there are some people who join the police force because they enjoy bullying people and they want a license to do that? Do you agree that there are some people who join the police force who have views other than your own about people of different races, and that they use the protection of the badge in order to do this? If you're willing to concede those points, then we can have a discussion. But if you want to say that it's a giant media conspiracy and that there's no racism in America, then there's no point, I would say, in reading books like To Kill a Mockingbird. Or, on the other side, critiquing it as just whitewashing of the race problem. That Harper Lee shouldn't be penalized for being a white person. It's okay for white people to give their perspective on the race issue. And I think that she does a good job here. Can it possibly be the perspective of a black person? Absolutely not. But I think the most moving scene in the book is at the end, in the trial, and spoiler alert, obviously, for those of you who haven't read the book, but there is a scene at the end of the trial in which the accused is basically ridiculed for thinking that a white woman would condescend to be attracted to him, that he would be the truth teller and she would be the liar. And everyone in the courtroom sort of gasped, like, how dare he think such a thing? And I think that that is a fair and valiant and useful perspective for understanding how people were thinking about these things in the 1960s. Are we still thinking about these things in some of the same ways? Absolutely. Are we progressing and changing and thinking differently on some things? Absolutely. But if you don't read the other side, or you don't, if I don't use the term other side, if you don't read the perspectives of others, even if they're popular, even if they're put forward as white man's understanding of racism, then you're not going to really get the larger picture. So I think for me, To Kill a Mockingbird is possibly overrated in the sense of everyone seems to look at it as some salvific book about race relations, and in that sense, I would agree with the black critics that I've seen on YouTube who are trying to push back against this narrative. I accept that it is not the be-all, end-all. Once a white person reads this, he or she will no longer be racist. Okay, I accept that that is a crazy idea. But what I do accept and what I would promote is this can open the door to a larger discussion. So reading a book like this, you can then sit down and say, have things changed in America? Do people see things differently between the races? And remembering that it's not the same. The way that I would argue, for example, the American Indian, the Native American, however you'd like to call them, they're almost the issue of how are they treated. They're ignored. They're not even. They don't even exist for most Americans. Most Americans have never been on a reservation. Most Americans have never met someone who's a Navajo or a Sioux or a Cherokee, etc. We don't have any experience with them, so we don't have the same type of relations with them. Or the Chinese, the fact that the Chinese were systematically excluded from citizenship despite being brought over as workers, and what that said for the vision of citizenship in the United States at that time, that it was clearly a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ideal that was trying to be preserved, as opposed to the narrative today that America is an immigrant nation. It's always been an immigrant nation, proudly an immigrant nation. And you have to look back and say, do the facts bear that out? And so the way that blacks are treated in America is a particular way because the institution of slavery in the United States was particular. It was not like slavery in other parts of the world. And that is why, for example, the rest of the world was seemingly able to get rid of that institution peacefully. The serfs were just freed in Russia. The slaves in the English Empire were paid for by the British taxpayers. I think it was only in the 1980s that debt was paid off. But that was a way to effectuate a peaceful freeing of the slaves. Every society had to figure it out according to their own culture. And America, where apparently all of our arguments are solved with guns, we had to kill 600,000 of our own people in order to, quote-unquote, solve the race question. Except, unfortunately, we didn't. Not only did we not solve the race question, but we didn't even solve our governmental question. Whereas here in 2022, we are still talking about states' rights versus federal government, when apparently that was all supposed to be resolved in 1865. So, bit of a tangent, and I've stayed away from the core of the book because I really want you to read it if you haven't read it before. And if you're an American, you're likely to have read it already. But I think I wanted to underline the importance of the role of the book and why it's unfair to call it whitewashing of race relations, or invalid or unimportant as a white person's perspective. It's a product of its time in the 1960s. I think it's valuable, and I don't think people should be excluded from talking about race because of their skin color. And if you can't pick up on the irony of that, there's nothing else I could do for you. This is the time of the video if you'd like to hit like, hit subscribe. These are things that help these videos get found in the algorithm. There's a link to buy the book below. I don't think it'll be to buy the Easton Press edition. I'll put another, probably a Penguin paperback, something similar, down in the video description. There's also a link to my Patreon down there. If you'd like to support this work, if you like what I'm doing here and you want me to do more, vote with your feet, vote with your dollars, and contribute on Patreon, and I'll be able to do more of these in the future. Until next time, enjoy your reading.